Alright guys, we are going to jump right into part 2 of our chem review. A lot of stuff, so sort of buckle up and get ready to go. We've got a lot to get through. The first thing we're going to talk about is the fact that water is probably one of the most unique substances in the universe, and the biggest reason for that is because of the hydrogen bonds. We left off a little bit in the last section talking about the polarity of water. And so remember that the oxygens have a slight negative and each of the hydrogens has a slight positive. If you see this little, if you see this little symbol, okay, that is a delta, and that means a small charge. So usually you're gonna see that with like a slight plus or a minus next to it, and that means a slight charge, not a full electron's worth. But what that does is that the slight negative and the slight positive between different water molecules binds them together. Okay, that's the hydrogen bonding. And that's going to lead to all kinds of unique properties of water. So let's roll through a few of them real quick. So surface tension basically means that the molecules want to hold each other together so tightly that on the top of it, it almost forms like a film on the top of the water. And so like you can see in this example, and I'll zoom it out a little bit here for you, you can see in this example here that there's actually a coin floating on top of the water. Usually in class we do a little thing where we float some staples or something on top of that. The next thing that we want to run through real quick is capillary action. Capillary action is basically that water will flow upward through things if the area that it's trying to flow up through is small enough. The example here is sort of a cinder block, and it's just sitting down in some water, and you see that the water just sort of automatically creeps up it. The reason that it does that is because the water molecules are holding tightly to each other, okay? They're cohesion, and then they're holding tightly to the other surface, exhibiting a lot of adhesion. Okay, so you got two terms there that are pretty important to us. So cohesion means that they hold together, and adhesion means that they hold on to other things. Okay, so capillary action, pretty important. You can see this too if you stick a straw down in a drink, that if you look really closely, that the liquid level in the straw is actually a little bit higher than the liquid, and that's again because of the capillary action. Now these are some of the biggest, most important differences in water. So water has a really high boiling point. It doesn't seem like it has a really high boiling point. 100 degrees Celsius, you're like, well, that's kind of high, but why is that so high? Well, water is a really small molar mass compound. Okay, its molar mass is 18 grams per mole, which is pretty small. Other molecules that are that small, they tend to have boiling points like around room temperature or lower. And so water is pretty unique. And again, the reason for that is that hydrogen bonding. It doesn't want to boil because the molecules are held close together. So the water molecules are really holding together really tightly, and so it makes it really difficult for them to escape from liquid into gas phase. Obviously, if it has a high boiling point, it tends to have a relatively high freezing point also. At 0 degrees Celsius. And then the low density solid, water is really unique in that the solid has a lower density than the liquid. Now, you're like, well, what does that mean? Well, just think about it. Think about the fact that ice cubes float on the top of water. That is really unique. Other substances, when you freeze them, their solids sink to the bottom. Water is one of the few things that the solid has less density and therefore floats on the top. That has some enormous implications for us in terms of life on the planet, because if the water sunk to the bottom, then it wouldn't basically, or the ice sank to the bottom, then it basically wouldn't insulate the life underneath and allow the water underneath to remain unfrozen, and therefore all of those life forms to be able to live underneath the ice. Water is also a really good solvent. In fact, it's such a good solvent that it has a special name. It's usually called the universal solvent. Now, when we say that something is universal, it means that it should apply to just about everything. That's not true. Water obviously won't dissolve everything, but it dissolves most polar compounds and pretty much any ionic compound to one degree or another. And if you take AP Chem, we'll talk a little bit about solubility. But that's a lot of stuff. There's very few other things that will dissolve that many things in them. Okay, so that's going to make water the universal solvent. Okay, shifting gears a little bit from water, I'm going to talk just real briefly here about the pH scale. You guys hopefully have a little bit of familiarity with the pH scale. This is the formula for pH. In chemistry class, hopefully you use this a little bit. So pH is the negative logarithm of the concentration of the hydrogen ions, or you might have heard it called the hydronium ions. Whenever you see these brackets, it means molarity, okay, in chemistry terms, which is moles per liter. And so that means that what you're measuring in pH is how much H plus is given off. And if it's a lot, then it's going to be down on this low end of the scale down here. Okay, so everything here, whoops, everything through 7, these are acids. Okay, obviously 7 is neutral, and then anything above 7 are going to be bases, okay, or alkaline. And hopefully you know that. Remember that since this is a logarithmic scale, that what that means is that each step that you take means that it's 10 times more acidic or basic. So like coffee has a pH of 5, vinegar has a pH of 3, and that means that vinegar essentially is about 100 times more acidic than coffee is, even though coffee is relatively acidic. And then you take like down here to an acid battery, we're talking about several orders of magnitude, 5, so it's like 10,000 times, actually 100,000 times stronger than coffee as far as being acidic. So just know what the pH scale is. Know as we go throughout the year that if you test something and it's got a pH lower than 7, then it's an acid. It's got a pH above 7, it's a base. And the higher it is, the more basic it is, or the more alkaline it is. The lower it is, the more acidic it is, the stronger an acid it is. You also note here that despite what you may have learned in middle school, you can actually go below 0 in your pH. You can actually go above 14 also, depending on what the concentrations. If you have really strong bases, really strong acids, and they're really concentrated, you can get those pHs to those extremes. Real briefly, just to refresh your memory a little bit about reactions. So this is essentially a reaction setup. And so what do you need to know about it? So reactants, okay, those are sort of like the ingredients. Reactants are on the left-hand side of the equation, or the arrow. On the right-hand side of the arrow are products. You don't always have one product. In fact, most of the time you have more than one product. So reactants on the left, products on the right. A few other things you need to know. Obviously, the arrow means produces or results in or yields is what we usually call it, the yield arrow. And then you need to know what the numbers are. The big number in the front is called the coefficient. That tells us either how many molecules or how many moles are required for that reaction to occur, or how many are produced. So this 3 would say I need 3 moles of hydrogen to get this to happen. This would say for every 3 moles of hydrogen, I get 2 moles of ammonia out. The little numbers are called subscripts, and they only apply to the atom that they're right next to. So this 3 only applies to the hydrogen. This 2, we could distribute it mathematically through the whole thing. And so that would mean I have 2 nitrogens, and 2 times 3 is 6 hydrogens. Now, why is that important? Because every equation that we're going to work with, they need to be balanced. Okay, and that's why you see the 3 here and the 2 here, because we could just write this as N2 plus H2 equals NH3. That would be an okay equation, but it wouldn't be good for any sort of math. It has to be balanced to get the math out. Now, why does it have to be balanced? The reason for the need to balance all goes back to something called the law of conservation of mass, or the law of conservation of mass. Now, what does the law of conservation of mass says? If you recall, it says that you can't, in an ordinary chemical reaction, you don't create or destroy matter. And so what that means is that if I've got 2 atoms of hydrogen over here, I have to have 2 atoms of hydrogen on the product side as well. And so that's what the whole balancing reactions process is set up to do. It has to obey the law of conservation of mass. All right, we'll run through real quick some stuff that hopefully you had in biology, or if you haven't had biology, maybe in some middle school life science, you talked about some of these things. We're going to talk about biomolecules. When we say biomolecules, that just means biological molecules of some kind. So essentially, we're going to split these up into 2 broad categories. Now, most biomolecules fit into this category, that they are organic compounds. They're going to contain a lot of carbon, and they're going to have a lot of carbon-carbon or carbon-hydrogen bonds. So the simplest example of a good organic compound would be something like methane, which is CH4, that you probably used a lot last year in chemistry. Okay, alcohols are examples of those, ethers, esters, all of those things. Most of the other biomolecules that we're going to talk about are organic compounds. Now, inorganic compounds have carbon, or don't have carbon, or they have carbon that doesn't have any hydrogen bonded to it. And sort of the classic example of this is carbon dioxide, okay, CO2. It has carbon in it, which would immediately get the brain to think that it's organic, but there's no hydrogen in it, so that we would classify carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. Those are inorganic compounds because they don't have any hydrogen bonds in them. So we're going to run through several of the biomolecule types. There are basically 4 broad categories of biomolecules. The first one are sugars, okay, or carbohydrates. Basically, they have an essential formula where they've got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in them in varying proportions. Okay, the proportion depends on what specific type of sugar. Usually, it's about a 2-to-1 ratio between the hydrogens and the carbons. But not always. Kind of, again, depends on what particular sugars we're talking about. Some examples of sugars that you guys would know: monosaccharides. And when you see the word saccharide, that means sugar. So monosaccharide means it's like one sugar by itself. That would be like glucose, or fructose is another monosaccharide. Disaccharides, something like sucrose. Okay, sucrose has a glucose and a fructose in it. Sucrose is ordinary table sugar, so it's got 2 monosaccharides bonded together. And then if you take a bunch of monosaccharides and bond them together to make a polymer, you get starches. Okay, so like the starches in potatoes or pasta, and also the inedible starches like cellulose that humans can't process. Our second category of biomolecules is proteins. Proteins are basically really long chain molecules, and they're made up of things called amino acids. Again, you can look back for that stuff on biology. And again, if you guys need some extra assistance on any of these biomolecules, just let me know. I can point you in the direction of some reading resources or some videos that will help you out with those. But you get these really long chains of these things called amino acids. And they're really important for us because enzymes are proteins, and most of, like a lot of what makes up your body, first off, are what are called structural proteins. And then most of what makes all of your body work the way it works are enzymes within your bloodstream and within your cells that help to catalyze reactions to make them actually happen at a rate that would sustain life. The third category of biomolecules are nucleic acids, and of course that's DNA and RNA, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. Obviously, they're the information storage, and particularly what's important for plants and animals is that this is where their genetics get stored so that they can pass down those genes to their offspring. So those are nucleic acids. And our last category of biomolecules are called lipids. Lipids are essentially anything fatty. That's sort of the term that comes to mind when we think of lipids. So triglycerides and cholesterol, which makes it sound like it's really bad, but the hormones and steroids that are in your body, those are also lipids. And so those are a category of biomolecules as well. A lot of stuff there. Feel free to rewind, go back, stop, pause, take notes wherever you need. We've got one more little section to cover, a little bit of chemistry, and then we'll be out of most of the chemistry except how we're going to apply it for the rest of the year.